Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Voice of Adoptees, which brings together diverse and unique voices from around the world to share their stories. If you like today's episode, remember to give us a like, subscribe, and leave a review. Here's your host, David Shunk.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Voice of Adoptees. Today, we're joined with Marina. She is going to be sharing her story that started all the way over in Russia. We're very familiar with a lot of Russian adoptees. We want to welcome her to the show, and we look forward to our conversation. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, first and foremost, tell us about yourself and who you are, and a little bit of, anything about yourself that we want to know.
So my name is Marina. I was adopted from Vladimir, Russia in 96 at 6 months old. I always talked about it as like kind of your textbook adoption from there. I had my one orphanage. Parents went over there, adopted me, brought me on back. And I've been living in Arizona ever since. So quite the switch up of climate, I guess. I've always had a very, open conversation with my family about my adoption, even so far as my mom would come to school on my gotcha day and tell all the other kids about, what adoption is. So, looking back, I was like, oh, it's so cool. Now I'm like, oh my goodness, it's so embarrassing. But it was really cool. I was always kind of known as the adopted kid in, going throughout school. So I've never really known any different. I've never kind of hid that fact at all. Everyone in my life, for the most part, has been very supportive about it. But yeah, I'm lucky to be in a family where they're very open about it and can talk about it with me. And I can't even remember having many questions growing up about it because of that fact.
Yeah, I can
So
relate. Absolutely. Yep.
yeah. So I know that's very a lucky thing to have. So I'm so grateful about that. So I mean, overall, I haven't had many of those, issues in terms of struggling with accepting the fact that I was adopted. But I do think just coming into like a new culture and trying to learn about where it is you come from is where a bulk of my adoption struggles have come from, of like identity and whatnot. So
Okay, we'll dive into that. Before we do and get into everything, you mentioned that you're in Arizona. Where in Arizona, you said? Believe it was Phoenix, Arizona you're from?
yeah, I'm in Phoenix, the Scottsdale
Okay.
area. So
Oh,
yeah.
excellent. Yep. I vacationed there many times. We would always go to the this was back when I think there was a steak restaurant actually that I loved that got shut down, unfortunately. I think it was like Jonathan's or something. But South Mountain is a gorgeous, and we'd always stay at the Legacy Resort, right? We'd
Nice.
play golf during the day and drive up to South Mountain at night and see the city. It was beautiful.
Love it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
And
cool.
Scottsdale, of course, is very nice, as we know. Um, but anyways, so let's go back to your story. That's why you're here. We're not here to talk about Dave's travels. That's another episode for another time.
Another podcast.
Yeah. Other podcast. Wrong podcast. So it's great that you mentioned, your family's been so supportive in that you almost, at times, maybe you could say you forgot that you were adopted at times. And I can relate to that big time, which is odd because you talk to a lot of adoptees and they say, some of them struggle with identity issues growing up. And you mentioned that a minute ago. We'll dive into that. And how do you think, so my question is, after me rambling, do you think your perception of adoption is different than most people because of the way you grew up?
I think so, yes. Yes and no, because I mean, all adoptees are going to have a unique experience, but also a similar experience in the sense that, no matter what age you're adopted or whatever your story is, there are the kind of those core things of, abandonment issues, identity issues, things of that sort. But for a long time, I think because I was able to be so open about it and I was adopted at such a young age, I kind of felt I not allowed to feel, that, the struggle that comes with it because, I've never known any different. I don't have memories of of Russia or anything of that sort. So for a long time, I, would happily forget that I was adopted just because I was like, well, this is my family. This is the way it is. Growing up, you kind of settle into those realities a bit more of I'm allowed to feel these things. I still have a whole background that I know nothing about. And your foundation is a little shaky while it's more filled in because you do have that stable family life from such a young age. You still have, you're kind of walking on a foundation that's a little bit, filled with holes, I guess. And every now and then you step in one and you fall down and you have to get back up. Whereas a lot of folks who don't come from the background of adoption kind of have a more filled in foundation, less likely to kind of get tripped up on those kinds of things. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you made about the foundation. I like that. You made a really good connection about how adoptees were missing that sort of foundation at the beginning because we have a story that has two sides to it where
Mhm.
you look at someone else who wasn't adopted, they can say, yep, they know their parents, they were born from them, yep, I have mom's eyes, yep, that's cool, and they move on. And for us, sometimes we don't have that information handy.
Yeah, that's always been a struggle too. Like you were saying, they know, what they're what they're going to look like. I'm a mix of A and B, and that was kind of part of it growing up. Where the moments I didn't forget about when I was adopted is when your family says things like, "Oh, you're the only one with green eyes in the family. Look at you, you're the only one with curly hair or something." And I'm like, "Oh, that's right. I'm the only one." So, it's fun and lighthearted in the moment, and they don't mean anything by it, but it gets to you a little bit of like, oh my gosh, I'm different. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Do you remember what age you started to, I guess, begin to understand that you were adopted?
This is going to be really funny, but there's the Rugrats movie, and there's that scene where I think it's like the Cyndi Lauper song where like I want a mom that'll last forever kind of thing, where Chucky's kind of like, "Who's my mom?" That sort of thing. I think he was.
Rugrats. Wow. I haven't heard
Oh,
that name in 25 years. But that shows how old I am. But I mean,
yeah.
geez.
It
Actually, I
it
just
got me
turned
down
20.
deep.
Yeah. Wow. That just hit home. Thanks for reminding me. It was just my birthday. I'm almost 30, so one more year. But wow, Rugrats. That mind blown
Rugrats
right
did
now.
it.
Okay.
Yes,
Yep.
Rugrats is it's like it's so specific, but I
Yeah.
remember listening to that song when that scene came on. Granted, the scene's not necessarily about adoption, really, but this song kind of got me, and I was like, oh my gosh! And I started really thinking like I think that's where kind of and at whatever age I was, preteen, much younger, like what 8, 9, I don't know, but I started kind of saying those mean things that come out, when you're angry with your parents, like, well, you're not even my real mom kind of thing. But that
Oh
that
boy.
song and that scene kind of really brought that up for me of I kind of felt like the my relationship with my family was, like I don't know, where it just everything kind of seemed less we love you unconditionally versus
Right.
oh my gosh is this a forever kind of thing. So yeah, I don't know, that's kind of where I started questioning things a little bit more, and it was never too much of like a like I said, it was like when I was angry about things and emotions were high, I would say those sorts of things. But I think a lot of my questioning stuff just came with my own, like, I'd search the internet at night for like 5 minutes and I'm like, okay, I'm done with that, got it out of my system. It's never been too much, it's been a lot of my own personal stuff, and if I find anything that I'm interested about, come to my parents about it. But my day to day, it's like love them, they love me, and I don't. And my mom even had a moment at the doctor's office, where she's filling out the family history, and she wrote in their whole family health history, and I'm like, Mom, that's not for me. Like, we don't know my family health history. She's like, oh, I
Yeah.
forgot.
Yep. Yep.
So, there's a lot of moments where it's like, yes, you feel different, but there's moments where like, oh, You guys don't even think about it every day.
Yeah,
That's cool.
that's really sweet. I would say one of the hardest things being adopted is the medical history. That one always threw me for a loop because I never knew for 27, 28 years what blood type I even was. Like, I mean, apparently my parents told me in the US that usually they take it at birth in America. I don't know if that's true anymore, or if it is, but they knew, but I never knew. So, until I reconnected with my family in Russia, then I was able to find out more genetic conditions and that stuff. But I never knew my blood type, and
Interesting.
fortunately I had a visit to the hospital a year ago, and during that time there, that's the first time I found out my blood type. And of course, there's me in the ER, and I'm like, oh, I'm A
Wow.
positive. That's so cool. And they're looking at me like, what? Are you okay? It's just like, no, you don't understand. I'm adopted. Like, that's the first time I've actually heard something like medically confirmed, and that's really cool for people like us. Like, we get a kick out of that. and
That's cool.
and th-
Yeah.
this poor girl looks like she's like 19 years old drawing blood. She's like, well, I'm glad I made your day. I'm like, yep, you sure did. But
Oh.
yeah,
That's happened to me too. I would always make jokes with my doctor growing up. I'm like, oh, I don't know my medical history. I'm like a kind of like a ticking time bomb. Anything could happen. Don't know what's going to happen. Could fall over at any minute. And there was an episode in college where I passed out for some reason that I didn't know why, and I was kind of freaking out a little bit. I'm like, oh no, is this where
yeah,
the family genetic conditions start coming in? I go back to my doctor. I'm like, well, I fell over. I literally fell over, don't know what it is. And that kind of episode of the not knowing, and I can't go to my mom and say,
yeah,
do we have family history of this? Should I be worried? What could it be? And, am I now subject to a bunch of tests just to find out, like narrow it down? That moment was really, really scary. And I was like,
yeah.
oh no, this is where it'd be great to know. So yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, so I mean, besides the medical history, I know you mentioned that you basically for the most part you didn't celebrate being adopted until it was at a later age you started to appreciate like this missing side of you. So my question is, what did you do to try to reintroduce the lost culture, or you could say your lost half of your story, as you continue to get more wise, as they would say politely?
Yeah, yeah. A lot of it started in kind of, I think it was high school, college type time. You're sitting, especially in high school, you're sitting in history class and you're learning the American side of history, and Russia's always the bad guy in all of these things. And I was kind of sitting there like, oh, is that all there is to? Because that was kind of the only piece of my ears perk up when I hear
Yeah,
Russian. I'm like, oh, this is cool. This is a really interesting topic. But all you hear is Russia did this to this person, Russia did this to this country, all of that sort of thing. And I'm like, well, there has to be more to that than what it is. So I'm a huge reader, and so one of my things is I started, picking up history books from, history of Ukraine,
yeah,
history of
yeah,
Poland, history of France, England, all those things, and next to a history book of Russia, and just kind of putting them side by side of like, what is Russia everywhere else? What's kind of trying to get a full picture of, you know, what Russia is. And that was kind of the start of it. And even to this day, that's still what I do. I'll pick up, like a Russian fiction book and read it against, like, why did the writer write it at this time? And I got really interested more so in that side of me of like every time I would read those kinds of things, I'm like, I feel a little more full. And,
yeah,
it's really satisfying to read these kinds of things because I felt like if I close my eyes, I'm sitting in a school over there and just like
yeah,
having a regular experience or something like that. So now even I have a old Russian cookbook too that I cook my way through. And every time I sit down and eat a meal that I've cooked, I'm like, maybe this is kind of what it would be like, sitting in a kitchen at, like, in a typical
yeah,
Russian home, and this is what I'd be eating or something. But those moments of just connecting to the culture for me has kind of been what's filling in gaps for me and kind of feeding my soul a little bit more and making me feel more complete, I guess, is really diving into that culture because it makes me, I see pictures of the people and I'm like, maybe I look like them or, stuff of that nature. I've really enjoyed kind of learning that cultural aspect. More so than I've wanted to like ever, meet at my birth family or anything of that nature. But at the most recent thing, though, pertaining to my adoption, on one of my gotcha days, where I was sitting around the table with my family, they had brought out some more of my adoption papers that I had never seen before. And I was like, oh, well, let's take a look at these things. Now that I have kind of this background knowledge of Russia, I'm very involved in this and very invested in this. Like, well, let's take a look at it. And I found my letter of relinquishment from my mom that was handwritten. I was
Yeah.
like, well,
Yeah.
maybe this was her handwriting. That's pretty cool. And I found the address up at the top. And I was able to,
Hmm.
I always knew I was born in Vladimir, Russia, to a mom that was possibly very young, couldn't take care of me. And the letter kind of, backed up what I had known. So, like, I know a little bit more about myself. This is cool. I Googled the address up at the top and found a little
Yeah.
town right outside of Vladimir. So again, I kind of was able to dive in a little bit more and pinpoint more of where I come from. So I'm, going on Google Maps and I'm like, this is like, the street that she was on or wherever she wrote this letter, like I could pin it down to like an apartment building. And that was just the coolest thing to me. So, I learned a little bit more of my history about the food that they eat there and all these different facets of the music, of the literature. And now I have this apartment building where I felt like every time I went and visited that little place on Google Maps, Google Earth, I could kind of have like a full experience of just sitting there staring at it. And I'm like, okay, this is that's what I
Wow. So
needed.
you
That's what I
mentioned a
needed.
lot of things
So
there. So
yeah.
let's go one at a time. Let's start with, you talked about cooking, and I'm a big foodie,
Yeah.
so I'm really interested in foods and trying foods from different
Mhm.
cultures and countries. And so why don't you tell me a little bit about the dishes you tried, and if you have a favorite one from that is Russian, Eastern European.
Yeah, yeah. I think my favorite one, of course, you have your borscht. So good. I've always loved beets growing up, but now that I figured out just how to cook them, where they are just like good every time, because there was a period where I was just burning them up in the oven and not good. I was like, how do they eat these things? They taste really gross. But I've learned to kind of, use them in a variety of soups. I think it's either Latvian or Lithuanian, where they have like a kind of a cold, I think they call it pink soup where it's beets with kefir or heavy cream and dill. And it turns into this really bright pink glob. It looks very questionable, but it's been my favorite dish so far.
Oh,
Um, the cabbage rolls as well. I've absolutely loved the labor that goes into it because when the cabbage breaks, I'm like, oh my gosh. But I'm just honestly sitting there with like cabbage in my hand at some points, putting a little thing, some of the filling and just biting into it. Was the beginning of the cabbage roll experience. But now when I sit down and eat
yeah,
those are the best.
galupsi,
Oh,
yeah.
the best.
That is so
You too?
good with
Yes,
some sour
yes.
cream, dill, and you can make it so many different ways.
Hmm.
But they mix either beef or
Mm,
pork or just beef, or they put like
yes.
carrots in it sometimes, or rice and dill, lots of dill, and
Hmm.
oh man, yeah, that's the best.
Amazing.
That is just whenever I cook that, anyone would come over and they'd be amazed because they'd never smelt something like that before ever,
Yes.
and they're like, "What is that?" And they're just blown away. But that's awesome. So,
Yes.
out of all the dishes you cooked so far,
Yes.
you think
Yes.
cabbage rolls is your favorite?
Definitely my favorite. The ones though that I haven't cooked myself because I haven't perfected it. The honey cake. You had that before? Where it's like the thin layers of cake, and in between they have the layers of it's like a sour cream kind of frosting.
Oh,
So
I
like
think I know
cake
what you're talking
frosting, and
about.
they're
Yeah,
very thin layers, and it is so good. Yes, There's a restaurant down a little bit a ways from me where I go and get
Nice,
that, but
nice. That's awesome.
that's
I
next
will
on my
say
list to perfect.
they do, yeah, cabbage rolls
Yes,
really well,
yes.
borscht really well, and blinis really well. The thin pancakes, so you, of course, a
Hmm.
little thing of sour cream, you get to dip
Yes.
it in, and oh, I had that. Yeah, I was in Russia back in 2014, I think. So it's been a while, like 9 years, yeah. But I was over there when Crimea was being invaded. Go figure. Like that was the perfect time to take a trip. But
Wow.
but I was over there, and I remember, yeah, just
Right.
eating Russian food. Obviously, in Russia, it's just like uh, you're just speechless. Like you're just shoveling all the food in your mouth. You just don't care what anyone thinks about you at the moment. You're just enjoying every minute of it.
Hmm.
And it was pretty funny when I was at my home city of Smolensk. It's right on the border of Belarus and Russia, right? So one morning,
Hmm.
the hotel we were staying at, they provided breakfast. So we had like little blinis and sour cream and like a little thing of OJ, like that size. It looked like a shot glass of orange juice, right? And I'm like, it's like two sips and
Yeah.
it's gone. You're like, okay, well, that was pointless. Like, and then so I asked the woman there if I could have some more orange juice, and she looked at me and she said, "No, you get one," and then walked away. And I'm like, "Oh, yeah." I'm like, "Well,
Like
guess
I
I'm
should have savored this more.
that's it." Yeah. But no, but the Bellinis though, and the food in general.
Oh
I
my
mean, when you're in
gosh.
Moscow, they have a very variety. It's like any big city. You're gonna have chains. You're gonna have like McDonald's and like well, now, they left for the current situation, of course. But anyway, back to your story.
Yes, yes.
So let's talk about you made a comment saying that you're more interested in the culture and relearning about Russia and what it means to be Russian, the food and traditions and holidays more than you are getting to know any relatives. So let's talk about that because I know that can be a bit touchy, but can you kind of maybe explain why
Mhm.
you're not so as interested as you are with the culture in finding your family and learning more about that side?
I'm not too sure why,
Yeah.
because that's one of the first questions you get. And I mean, I would always say, I wouldn't say no to it. I and it's nothing like I have any kind of anger towards them or anything of that nature. It's just more of a I've honestly never thought too much of it. It for whatever reason, it's the culture and just wanting to feel Russian that has been my biggest struggle and my biggest want in this whole journey. We were bringing up medical history before, and that's kind of the only reason I would want to either meet my birth mom, birth father, or anyone like that. Just to kind of maybe know that portion, but I don't know what it is. There's nothing calling to me for it. I always felt like, since I don't speak Russian, we would be there with a translator and I can't, in my head, I'm like, how special can that be? And that could change, down the line as maybe I'm now satisfied with my feelings of learning more of like that cultural identity and maybe now I'm ready to graduate and step, but just so far growing up, I don't know. It would be cool to see a picture, I
Yeah.
suppose.
Yeah.
But there's something about it that seeing the address in the letter, even then when I was seeing that, I was never like, oh my gosh, like cool, she wrote that. But I just want to see where it is in the town. Like I can't really put it into words, but it's just never been a calling to me. It's never been a sensitive subject. It doesn't really bring up too much sadness for me. But again, I could get there at some point in my journey. I don't know.
Yeah, I was gonna say, so I guess my next question would be, would that change that need or want to learn more about your family if you knew you're going to go back for a trip to see Russia and to see what the culture's like, and you're going to go over there? So maybe part of you is thinking, well, I'm here, might as well just get it, not like get it over
Yeah.
with, but You
Yeah.
know,
But yeah, no, I think so. Like, especially, how many chances do you get to do that?
exactly. Yeah.
Absolutely. If it was like, all set up and it was a sure thing that it was going to happen, I would. I think maybe part of it is like a rejection thing of, well, what if I reach out and they don't want to see me, and like I'm better off just not seeing them at all at that point.
Yeah.
That could be, somewhere back there. But oh, absolutely. Like if it was all set up and I was going to Russia, why wouldn't you? At that point, at least you know what they look like. You've had that conversation. You could say you did it. I don't think I would regret ever doing that
Yeah.
for sure. But yeah, yeah.
So to let's move on to this story about a gentleman near your town that you were from, or close to the town you were from.
Hmm.
I believe his name was Andre or Andrew. Andrew.
Andrew. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So why don't you tell us about this special individual and kind of how you formed this
Mhm.
connection with him?
Yeah. So, like I said, in college, when I found that letter of relinquishment, I had Googled that address and found that apartment on Google
Yeah.
Maps. And as I was doing all of this, you're in college, I was sitting in my bed with my roommates, and because they're like, "This is so
Yeah.
cool!" Like they love kind of being on that journey with me.
It-
And it became, a full on like, you know. You have your wine in your living room, and you have like the red string going across the board. They're getting a kick
No,
out
no,
of it.
seriously,
Um,
I had the same thing when I
yeah.
was trying to track down like what relatives came from where. When I found like information on my father's side, I had a giant map printed on the wall of Russia, Ukraine, Lithuania, Belarus, and tacked with
Yes.
strings and pictures attached to where the strings were.
Oh my
And these
god.
the RA came by at one point and was looking in with her friends, and she just like shook her head like, "What? Who are you?" I'm like, honestly, I'm just this is just helping, visuals and all that. And she just looked at me and she's like, "Nah, you're probably." She's
I
like,
love
"Nah, like this is like." She's like, "David, this is like straight up CIA stuff. Like, what is this?"
it.
And
That's how
I,
it is. It's gotta be like it's a
yeah,
process.
but so your friends are very
Oh, it's
into it. So
amazing.
yeah,
Yes. And one of them had said something interesting to me because we were kind of going on this hunt of like, well, now that we have this address, let's just find your mom. And, we're really just getting into it. But she had said something that really stuck with me of everybody these days has social media. And at first we were, I was like, oh, I doubt she is. And for a second we were kind of looking at, the various Russian social media sites, and then Facebook, Instagram, that kind of thing. And, typing in her name from my birth certificate, trying to find something. Couldn't find anything. I'm like, typical. Didn't expect to. But I don't even know the timeline of it, but a little bit down the line, maybe a few years after that, that line popped back up in my head of everyone has social media. And so I put the city name Stavrovo, which is the smaller town, into Instagram, and I hit that little places tab on Instagram, and all these pictures came up of the town.
yeah,
And I was like, this is so cool. So I'm scrolling through there forever. And there was one account that I could see that tagged every single one of the pictures as Deborah wrote. And they were the most beautiful pictures of like, these fields, the churches, and, all these like festivals that went on around there. And I was like, who is this Andrew person? So I clicked on him. I started following his account. I'm like, this is so cool. This is like my little, it's like I'm there every time I
yeah,
see a picture of his. It's very cool. And I randomly just reached out. I screenshotted that little address. I said, do you speak English? He's like, a little bit. I said, do you know this address? And he was like, oh my gosh, everyone lives there. Everyone lives in that apartment. It's like, the main one in the
yeah,
town. And he was kind of like my boots on the ground over there,
yeah,
where I got to kind of, ask him any questions I wanted to about that. He did kind of find some information about somebody who had my birth mother's name. Because after that, I was like, well, do you know this name? Like, does it ring a
Yeah.
bell?
Yeah.
How small of a town is this? Does everyone know everybody? And, he came back with, she now lives in this town. She has a family. And I, again, was like, this is really cool. I took it with a grain of salt, of course, because who knows how accurate, like, our birth certificates are and names and all of that.
Yeah.
So I think it's really cool. It's interesting to know, but I didn't really dive into much on birth family after that. Afterwards, it was, he would send pictures of like the food that they were eating. I was like, what is that? Tell me what it is. And we're kind of going back and forth in some like broken English, broken
Yeah.
Russian,
Yeah.
just trying to communicate a little bit. And now, we say happy holidays to each other every year, happy birthday to each other. And it's almost then become like a pen pal kind of thing. And again, it's kind of that satisfy that fulfillment that I need, what I was looking for in the most part of like
Yeah.
a friend, a connection to that specific address to Russia that I've really gotten through him. And I don't know if like we're really good friends. I don't know if he understands how much it means to have all this, because everything he's doing, he's posting like that's
I
so
could imagine what
cool.
like the buddy next to him was probably asking him like, "What are you doing?" And he's like, "I don't know. I'm taking pictures of my food and saying to some girl in America."
Right? Like it sounds so bizarre, but
But
he's just a hoot to follow. Like it's amazing.
yeah, and I'm sure if he understands like how special something like that is for us being adopted,
Mhm.
and we're getting like an inside view of like their day to day life, and that's something that
Yeah.
we never knew how they lived, or which is kind of odd to say given like technology these days, but it's just like you
Yeah.
said, it brings you a bit closer to a part of where you came from,
Mhm.
where you don't grow up and someone 20 years down the road wants to ask, well, where were you born? What's it like there? And you can say, I don't know. Google Images says this,
Mhm.
but who knows? I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. So, and now, his stories are on Instagram, or him, walking around filming like festivals and stuff. And I'm just sitting there like, whoa, this is so cool. For him, it's just everyday life. But I'm like, this is so cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, I really appreciate him and his friendship that we've developed over the years. He's been so big on this journey, whether he knows it or not.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, appreciate him a
That's
lot.
awesome. And you were saying that
Yeah.
you never bothered to ask him to try to find your family at all.
Not too much. Most of it was just that initial question of like, well, I don't know if I'm ever going to talk to you again after this, because this was again it was in the first time I talked to him. I was like, do you know this address? Of course. And then I was like, well, while I have you, can you find out about this person? And after that, it had been a couple months before he responded to that question. I was like, oh no, did I overstep? Do you think it's weird? But he came back with this whole thing of like, this is what I found out from some people around town. I was like, oh, that's really cool. So again, took it with a grain of salt. I haven't really dug too much. I said, if you ever find a picture of her, if she comes back, if she still has family there, you know, think of me. So he knows kind of the situation. He knows the name to kind of look out for. So who knows if anything comes of it in the coming years. But I hope so. That would be very cool if he was that connection there too.
Yeah.
But so far, it's just kind of been a little pen pal. These are some cool holidays and festivals, and I'll do the same too. He sent me a. He went to Moscow, I think, and he found in some store a shirt that said Arizona on it. He's sending a picture. He's like, "Look, Arizona!" So it's just kind of been
But yeah,
goofy things like
meanwhile,
that.
the clerk's staring at him like, what is going on? I can just imagine the looks of people at that. Like,
I'm so curious of his side of the story, but
when we went back to Russia, I took my adoptive parents with me, and my adopted dad is very well known for his. Trying to say this nicely, his let's just say he loves American food so much he expects it everywhere in the world. All right. So
oh
so
no.
so we get to Russia, and we had this woman that was a lawyer, actually, that grabbed us from the airport. Her name was Luba, really, really nice girl. And she picked us up, and we thought she was going to, kind of just walk with us around the city that day. And turns out she had to go to work, but she didn't tell us that. So she drove us to the middle of Moscow, right by the Red Square, dropped us off, and said, "I got to go to work. I'll see you tonight," and just drove off. And we're sitting. So both my parents turned and looked at me, and they were like, "Well, you're the one who did all these Russian courses and lessons over the years, so you're our translator for the day." And I'm like, "All right, well," I'm
Wow.
like, "Okay, so," I'm like, "First we need to find out, which direction the red square is." And my dad was like, "Oh, no problem. I'll figure that out." And I'm like, "Oh boy." And he walks over to one of the oldest, like, babushkas, on the street corner, just like just
Yeah.
sweeping up next to her little shop. And he goes over, he's like, "Do you know where the red square is?" And this woman, who's clearly doesn't speak one word of English, is just staring at him. And I'm like, all right, like, this isn't working out. But it's funny how when you're in Russia, how they talk about, what does a Russian look like? Do you look like a typical one?
Hmm.
And then there's the argument of, you know, no, because Russia has so many different types of people in the country. There's no good type. But what is strange that happened to me a couple times, and I spoke to a couple other adoptees as well when they travel back, is
Hmm.
if they went with like their adoptive parents or someone that looked not Russian, right? They would like
Hmm.
a sales associate would walk up and speak in English to them, to the parent, and say, "Can I help you with anything?" No,
Wow.
turn and look at you and start speaking Russian because they just apparently look like.
Oh my
Yeah,
God.
so that happened to me a few times in Moscow, and it was almost like a, wait,
Wow.
what? But
Yeah.
so my question, I guess, going forward with that is, have you tried to study the Russian language or take that up?
It's been on my bucket list. I think there have been some starting and stopping. I think it's definitely one it's up there on my list to do because I have all these like really cool books I want to read. 'Cause people will, know about me that I really like reading like
Yeah,
Russian like books about Russia. So I've gotten a few over the years that are in Russian. I was like, well, it'd be really cool to read these
yeah.
eventually. And and there's adoption documents that I have, some of which aren't translated, or I question the translation. I'm like, does it say that? I'd be curious to know. So it's up there, and especially to communicate with some of those people in Russia that I've befriended over the years.
Yeah.
Um, I absolutely want to because I do get that too, like you were saying, when they turned to you and spoke to you in Russian. When I go to a Russian shop over here that sells some imported goods and such, everyone in there, the first thing they just start speaking to me in Russian. I'm like, oh no, no, no. They're like, oh, interesting. You don't really? And I'm like, no. So it's pretty cool to have that happen to you because it kind of makes you feel kind of seen
It's a
as
big
a Russian,
culture shock.
whereas
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
is. So I really do want to. I think with everything I've done, read, researched, ate over the
Yep.
years, I think
Yep.
I have to at this point to just start dabbling at
Yeah.
least.
Yeah.
So
Well, that's
yeah.
really cool. Do you do any other activities that are centered around adoption in general? Not just Russia, but like in general, like what other
Yeah.
experiences have you had in your life so far?
Well, so far, so I'm not in school currently. What I'm studying to do is I do want to not just for Russia stuff, but to get involved in adoption, foster care systems here as well. Because I think it's so important to have um, diverse voices in that field, I think is very needed. So that's where I'm headed. So far, I've been volunteering with a nonprofit called FRUA. I don't know if you've heard of it.
Yep.
It's a national organization, but I've been volunteering with them, and they, of course, have started and have been focused on Russian Ukrainian adoptions. But over the years, it has grown so much to encompass a wide variety of different countries as well. So being involved in that organization has been really great and also, opened me up to, what's beyond my own experience, what's beyond just, the international adoption experience as well. And talking to a lot of more folks, especially in my community, about their adoption, whether that's international or just a domestic adoption. Like,
Yeah.
how do you and I differ? How are we really similar? And I think it's very cool in the adoption community to get involved in that because, you grow up feeling really isolated for the most part. At least I have. And then as you talk to more adoptees, you get to connect with a lot of people. So it makes your world feel a lot bigger.
Yeah.
And I think that's really cool that, something that could make you feel so isolated for so long can also, down the line, if you allow it to, make your world a lot bigger.
Yeah.
Because you get to connect in this unique experience that not a lot of people actually
Yeah.
have.
No, absolutely.
So, yeah, yeah. So that's kind of been the journey so far. But yeah, I hope like with my studies, things keep going as they're going. I do want to get into whether it be like more of a social work law aspect of it. I really like that aspect of making sure people are heard and seen and getting involved in those organizations that can help that happen for a lot of folks. So
Nice.
yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, it's a big field to get into. And there's so many different
Mhm.
avenues that you can pursue, whether it's, being a social worker or being on the
Mhm.
policy making side of things and dealing with DC and adoption laws and advocating. And
Yeah.
there's so much you can do out there and the system really needs the younger generation to step up and kind of take over and push
Yeah.
out some old stuff that's been there too long that are outdated and not helping. Yeah. But so my final question to you is the most important one. What advice can you leave to our listeners after today?
Oh goodness, a big one at the end. I would say I would say to really listen to people. And that goes for adoptees telling their story, like hoping that people are very receptive to the fact that an adoptee, what you've heard, if you've heard one, you haven't heard all of the stories. There's so many perspectives, so many things that could happen in their world that I hope a lot of people continue to listen and learn from those experiences, but also to the adoptees to always keep listening and learning, whether it's about themselves or, the world around them, to not kind of shut themselves off because, maybe they have one thing that they're dead set on of like, this is my story, this is how it was. I hope that, I think it's very important that as you're learning, you're listening and being receptive to your narrative changing or, being bigger than what they are. I think that's very common too of like, this was my story, this is how it was. And then they live the rest of their lives like that, never really listening to anything else, but being receptive that, your story is you're constantly learning about your story. I hope you're always listening and letting it change so that, one thing's not dictating your life for the rest of eternity. But I think the world just needs to listen to each other most of all. But I think, what you're doing is really great of giving that platform for people to listen to adoptive voices and people involved in this space. So it's really cool what you're doing. So thank you.
My pleasure. Marina, thank you so
Yeah.
much for joining us today. It's been an absolute joy getting to know you and hear your story. And you're doing a great job with everything. And it sounds like you are passionate, especially about adoption. And it definitely shows. And I look forward to seeing your journey. And if anything changes and you want to come back on anytime, just let us know. If you need any resources or suggestions on people, if you're curious about your birth family, to take it to another step, just let me know.
Yeah.
I'll send you some information I have. I mean, we'd be more than happy to
Thank you.
help.
I
Yeah,
appreciate that.
absolutely. But thank you again for your time. It's been a pleasure. And
Thank you.
we will see you soon, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Marina over from Arizona today on Voice of Adoptees. You can view her episode coming soon on our website or all the podcast platforms we support. If you want to come on to the show, voiceofadoptees.com. We're always here for you. Thanks for tuning in today. We see you next episode. Voice of Adoptees. Who am I?
Thanks for listening to Voice of Adoptees. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, and leave a review. See you next time.